Is there something that's very kind of culturally grounded in terms of the idea of rightness in the first place? You mentioned briefly the idea of Jainism and religions, and I have to say the idea of multipolarity or multi-layeredness strikes me in some ways like some of the theories of the universe, in which actually we don't have one reality but multiverses that operate at the same time depending which reality you're in. So is that sense of multiplicity helpful in terms of moving us away from the idea that there is one sort of objective reality, or is that not the purpose of that way of thinking?
Well, I think the Jains themselves thought that they were paradoxically giving a view of reality as multiple. So they wanted to be able to, they were addressing this very disputatious and highly pluralistic context of classical India, where because there wasn't one text that people could agree on, there wasn't sort of one set of doctrines that people were required to interpret. They were trying to find how could you have a framework in which you are epistemically accessible to the other person. How is it that we don't seem to be able to agree century after century upon anything? How are you going to reconcile these features? So their view was to say, well, perhaps it's because this world in which we live can contain incompatible truths. Now, I think that works perhaps better as a kind of a justification for the nature of human psychology, that we're simultaneously committed to the search for truth and at the same time baffled by the fact that we don't seem to be able to agree on too many things. Whether that then can become a program for people to be able to engage with each other, I think that's going to require certain other kinds of intellectual virtues, which are not really about the truth, but the nature of our engagement with each other. And I rather suspect that some of both Santiago and Corine might want to say more about the way in which the conditions of agreement have a bearing on what we accept to be the problem about truth.
Okay, thanks very much. And just to say one thing, Ram, and I'm not going to come back to you on this because I want to bring the others in, but just to say in terms of the definition of working today, you very neatly, if I may say, elided us from the question of whether things are right, which is what the debate's about, to whether they're true. Now, obviously, there can be a confluence between the two, but of course, there is at the very least a sort of moral freight on rightness, potentially, that I think we do need to tease apart a bit. But I'm going to turn, if I may, back to Santiago to do that, because if we look at this question of whether you can definitively say whether something is right rather than whether it's true, the two are not incompatible, but it's not actually quite the same question, is it?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think it's
I'm right, but I may be true as well.
Yeah, you're right, you're true, but only among each other. In other words, the question here is that truth is really a result of our social agreement we decide upon ourselves. Because if we look, for example, at climate change, which is a very good example, Bruno Latour, who is a very important philosopher of science, pointed out in his last book that, well, facts alone, truth alone, right alone does not work. It's not sustained. That's a problem with fake news and all that. So truth alone we're not going to do anything with that. He explains in the book that it's called Down to Earth in English, that, well, you need institutions, you need established newspapers, you need academics, you need a whole establishment in some way, although we shouldn't use the word perhaps establishment, in order to sustain truth, being right, or facts. So I think it's very important to take into consideration that, well, truth in some way, it's basically what our contemporaries let us get away with in some way. So basically what we all agree upon in some way. This is why I think that it's important to point, just one more thing, it's important to point out that fundamental values are not the result of a historical development toward truth, but rather an agreement among social communities. This explains why the history of science is not a perfect unilinear history. And by the way, why are we hermeneutic philosophers going against this? Why are we saying this thing? Well, a lot of people think, well, it's because of some theoretical reasons, some knowledge we achieved. No, on the contrary, it's more for an ethical justification. In other words, if we look, for example, someone who explained this very well is Bauman. Zygmunt Bauman pointed out very clearly that the problem with this huge rational, Western rational modernist dream of embracing this absolute view and basically of Western civilization. The problem with this view is that genocide follows, colonialism follows. You end up by imposing in some way, okay, a value that perhaps a lot of people do not want to have. Now, it's very important, and this is really my last point, is that, well, there are different levels of truth too. If I tell you right now that there is a library behind me, of course we all agree that there is a library behind me. But that, from a theoretical, even an ontological point of view, it's very poor. I mean, it's not a great statement. If I tell you that it's a beautiful library, well, you might disagree. And if I tell you what books I have, you might totally disagree. So here it's a question that we have to really take into consideration that there is no neutral language that we can all use. There are several languages upon which we should have what I prefer to call a conversation rather than a dialogue, right? A dialogue is something that Plato did, ending up by taking the slave from the cave. A conversation is something more weak that you don't really know where it's going to end.
Thanks very much indeed, Santiago. And don't worry, we will be coming back to you. But Corine, I think we seem to be moving in a direction where we're looking at what's true and making that perhaps a subset of what's right. Do you have yourself a set of, I mean, to use a dangerous word these days, objective standards about how we can actually define what is true? Is that something we can meaningfully say? Can you meaningfully say it?
Yeah, I think surprisingly, I think it is something we can meaningfully say. And I think, both Santiago and Chakravarthi are going to agree, to be, for claim or theory to be true, then it's just going to be something about, correctly describing what it's aiming to describe or what it's talking about. Obviously, I take your point about being true and being right, and there is one way to understand being right as being correct, and that sort of connects up with true, and that there's one way of being right which is more has to do with other kinds of norms and perhaps has an ethical dimension which is different. I took it that the debate was about the first notion. I'd like to react to one thing Santiago said and also one thing that Chakravarthi said, if that's okay. So I do agree with Santiago that truth, if you think of a theory like anthropogenic climate change, it's a very complex thing, a theory, and truth is not everything. I agree with him that truth is not everything. I mean, there are issues to do with, establishing the truth or arguing for the truth, having the right institutions that enable you to do that, and then et cetera, et cetera. But true, sometimes, we should slide between saying truth is not everything and truth does not matter or is not the aim of the theory or something like that. I mean, it might be the case that, truth is not everything, but that doesn't mean that it's kind of nothing or that, truth is not actually the key thing that is operating in us looking for theories. So I think I'd like to hear more about that. I was interested by what Chakravarthi said about incompatible truth and the possibility of there being, often we presuppose that there is just one truth out there and, it's a matter of finding it and then, perhaps there aren't, there are several truths and they can't all be true. I think I would be reluctant to sort of think of that as something that has to be, taken to hold across the board. I think, you might, he was interested in talking of religious theories or religious views. That's one thing. Maybe science is another thing. So I think we can, perhaps agree that there are areas where the idea of a unique truth is, has to be revisited or perhaps massaged in some way. But we shouldn't think that because that's the case in all areas, and especially in areas where we might have better claims to think that is just a unique way the world is, then we should give up on there being a unique type of truth. But it's true that there might be contexts in which that's different.
Ram, come on in.
If I may come in on that. So yes, that's exactly what I mean when I said that, we have to move away from a monotonic notion of truth. That is to say that perhaps using, for example, Stephen Jay Gould's idea of, magisteria, we might.
Could you just explain that idea briefly, Ram? Sure. People may not know what it is.
Yes, of course. I was just coming to that. Yeah. So the idea that Stephen Jay Gould was trying to say, how is it that you could have religious lives which are coherent and grounded and driven by particular claims about knowledge, which have no bearing on, or in the case of creationism, perhaps come up against, the theories of evolution. And he was interested also in the fact that many religious traditions in the world had no problems with evolution. And yet, of course, they were not concerned with finding out.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.